And welcome back. So we're going to talk about the modern world. The modern world kind of sort of starts beginning with the Reformation and the Renaissance. And let me write this here. And at this point, especially with the Renaissance and the Reformation, the Catholic Church starts to lose its grip on Europe. And monarchs begin to lose some of their power also. So you have, very important governmental and societal changes that start with the Renaissance and the Reformation. So some ideas kind of start to come about. Part of that is the Protestant ethic. Again, I've spoke about this in a previous lecture. There are many flaws with this theory. Many of these things also, many of these countries that were Protestant and successful also happen to greatly emphasize individual property rights, the right or the ability to challenge governments. So there's many other kind of factors that contribute to these countries' wealth. But one thing that did occur under the Protestant Reformation was this idea that you can work hard and enjoy this world today. Not only live kind of a miserable life on earth in exchange for some sort of salvation in the afterlife. So that encouraged many of the things like thrift, saving, and sobriety in the early Reformation period. And of course, the Renaissance also, particularly in Italy, started capitalism in many ways. So people began to invest in ventures. Free markets began to kind of harness extra leftover money that people had saved. There was kind of a harnessing of greed. They began to have some consumer protection laws. However, visible wealth was no longer seen as something that was inherently evil as it had been before. And people also began to notice that that fixed amount of wealth that existed during the Middle Ages was actually an amount of wealth that could be growing, actually. It was an amount of wealth the world economy could actually grow, in particular with an emphasis on trade and investments. Now the Renaissance, that era starts kind of changing as we start getting into the colonial era and the Industrial Revolution. Now let's talk a little bit about the colonial era. Now this is more of an American-centric perspective. So you may remember that we talked about how important it was to have leftover money to invest in something. And these kinds of investments led to early corporations in England. So for example, many of you may know that some of the first colonists that we had in the United States were those that landed in Jamestown, Virginia in 1606. Now they were sponsored by the London Company, who hoped that in Jamestown there'd be lots of gold and all sorts of resources that they could exploit in the New World. So these people were sponsored by investors in England. Okay? Of course, as you know, that there wasn't a lot of gold in Jamestown, but it was a place that you could grow tobacco and cotton. Not to use a Disney reference, but some of you may have seen that movie Pocahontas. That's all about the Jamestown settlement. Now, the Pilgrims were also financed by a corporation. It was called the Plymouth Company. And those are people who initially intended to send them to Jamestown. These pilgrims kind of got lost, so to speak, and they wound up landing in New England. But again, the whole goal was not so that certain people could get religious freedom or anything like that. It was investors who were backing kind of explorers, adventurers, and colonists, hoping to make a very large profit on their initial investment. Now, in the U.S. in particular, international trade in the coastal regions of the United States expanded. Again, there were ships coming and going from the major ports. And inland farmers, of course, created a base for this agrarian economy. So kind of inland, you had farmers shipping their goods to the coast. There was a little bit of light industry going on there. And then goods were in turn shipped to England for further refinements and industrialization. Ben Franklin was an interesting character during this period because he actually indicated that the pursuit of wealth and hard work, thrift, and saving were actually good things. They were good virtues, and they weren't something that you should necessarily be morally suspicious of. Now, also in the young nation, now we're kind of shifting from the colonial era, I apologize, to the young nation. As a young nation, there was kind of a divide in thinking. You could almost say the same divide still exists today, and it exists in many countries. But it's kind of that traditional fight between urban and rural, the countryside and the cities. And Alexander was the champion of the cities. He thought that industrial growth was the secret to national power, international prestige for the young nation. And he had this idea that the coastal areas would become these grand centers of finance and manufacturing. This was the key to American success. And he kind of flipped that with someone like Thomas Jefferson. Now, he said, actually, an agrarian economy and kind of this society of landowning farmers was the best, the most equitable social order. So now we kind of start shifting to antebellum period. So before the Civil War. In the antebellum period, basically the America started to see kind of continued in industrial growth. The Industrial Revolution really started taking off in the U.S. And as that happened, you started having a large-scale rejection of capitalism, of this disparity of wealth between the wealthy capitalists, the proletariat in Marx terms, the bourgeoisie in Marx terms, the wealthy industrialists, and proletariats, urban factory workers, and also farmers on the other hand. And so these people, some of these people that rejected capitalism started trying to create what we called utopias. And a utopia is kind of a idealized community where everybody has the exact same amount of resources and everybody contributes equally and everybody lives happily. The New Harmony utopia was one of them. The Oneida community. These communes generally failed in practice because it was all, fluffy thinking in clouds, not necessarily any sort of thought grounded in reality. And you had a lot of stories. You think about the people that were fleeing the capitalist world. These are people that maybe didn't want to work very hard. And so you had people going, yet of course you had the usual problems when you isolate people in an enclosed environment. You had people not working, you had people stealing, some people still had more than others. It wound up being a total disaster. Now, typically people think that these utopias were only a product of the antebellum period, but actually they still exist today. I had a colleague when I was in graduate school. Her research was on what we call planned communities, and these were utopias, and a few dozen of them still exist in Europe. What do you see there? You have these communities where the kids aren't going to school, there's no running water, they have radio for a couple hours a day, people aren't bathing. It's not good, okay? But these are people who choose to live this way. Even though I reject that kind of a lifestyle, I guess it's good for some people. So we also had another movement that kind of started in the antebellum period and then progressed till just about World War I, and that's the Populus movement. And that's another movement that was kind of anti-capitalism, anti-bourgeoisie, but very different than those who advocated for utopias. And populists typically blamed all the social ills on industry, and they wanted a lot of radical reforms, including government ownership of railroads, telegraph, telephone companies, banks, anything that was a large industry they thought the government should own because business wasn't inherently responsible enough to own it. Again, as I mentioned a couple lectures ago, this was the character of populism from the 1800s to the early 1900s. However, populism is a recurrent trend. As I mentioned before, in the Bible there were populist revolts. The Spartacus revolt was a populist revolt. And even we have populist sentiments in modern America. They just take different forms. It's not always farmers versus industrialists. There's a variety of movements and interpretations that it can take. The populists also wanted to expand the money supply, abandoning the gold standard, because they thought that would increase the wealth of farmers. It was a successful movement, sort of. They tried to elect William Jennings Bryan as president. He was defeated, and that was kind of when the populist movement, that particular populist movement, began to fizzle out. Now we also have the progressives. One of the greatest progressive thinkers, and if you take the sequel to this course, you'll get to explore probably the mother of modern management, Mary Parker Foley, who was a great progressive thinker, but we'll talk a little bit more about her next semester, those of you that take me again. But yeah, the progressive movement was this idea. It started kind of around the turn of the 20th century, and it believed that, well, actually, if there was some social reform, then that would also be kind of economic progress. So in a way, you're finding ways to kind of merge business and society. It's kind of in many ways, a seed of corporate social responsibility, which we'll talk about very soon. It was actually a legitimate mainstream political doctrine. They thought that government could control abuses of big businesses, but if it didn't, then businesses should step up and do the right thing. Now, they had a number of victories. They broke up some of the trusts and monopolies. For example, Standard Oil. They started outlawing campaign contributions by corporations, although we know that didn't last very long. Child labor was a big problem in the early Industrial Revolution, and they outlawed child labor. Child labor was very popular in factories. One, you didn't have to pay kids much. And of course, you can imagine small little hands can easily get into machines to repair them. Of course, unfortunately, small little hands can also be torn off in a machine. So they really worked to outlaw child labor. They were the ones that passed the first corporate income tax, and they regulated food and drug companies and public utilities. We'll talk more about consumerism later in this course. Another movement that started, it's attributed to Karl Marx, but I think it's a little bit older movement than that. You have two similar but very different movements. You have socialism and communism. So let's start with socialism. Okay. I have yet to visit a country in the world that doesn't have some aspect of socialism. If I was to summarize socialism in a nutshell, it's just the basic idea that in some way the government has a responsibility to its people. That's all socialism means. Now, every country I've ever been to has some aspects of socialism. Even here in the United States, we have a ton of socialist mechanisms. Think of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, universal public education up through high school. Those are the big ones. But we have many others too. Okay, so some people might say that socialism is advocacy of a classless society and these kinds of things. No, that's really more communism, which we'll kind of compare and contrast. Now, when I lived in France, France is much more socialized society than we are in the United States, and they always laugh. They say that they don't reject the values of capitalism. They say, oh, it's capitalism with a conscience. I don't know. And in France, we had many greater social reforms. I mean, even as a graduate student, I had stamps for everything. I had restaurant stamps. So I would give my employer €3, and they'd give me a voucher for €8.50, and I could get about 10 of those a month. And so I could use those to go out to eat. I mean, what an idea. We had vacation stamps. So you get these vouchers so that you could use them at a hotel or for a train ticket, because everybody has a right to a vacation, I guess. We used to get book stamps because everybody has the right to read. You know, you got housing subsidies. You got all sorts of these stamps that were there. Of course, medical care was also much cheaper than it is in the United States, although you do get what you pay for. So socialism is something that exists everywhere I've ever been. If you can find an example of a country that has absolutely no socialism whatsoever, please tell me. I would love to know. Put it in the comments. Tell me in class. I'm very curious. Now, some people think that socialism has its roots with Babeuf. And, you know, that's this idea of seizing possessions and giving to the masses. This is really more of something affiliated with Karl Marx and communism, this idea of seizing wealth. I think that socialism really has its roots in Judeo-Christian values, the idea that government and businesses have kind of this responsibility towards society. You hear about kings giving wealth. Robin Hood was, you could even argue that someone like Robin Hood was in some way a socialist. So I'm not sure that there's a distinct person that you can say started socialism. I just don't think that's right. Even Karl Marx is typically associated with things like communism, but you have to remember Karl Marx was very impressed by things like the Paris Commune. And that's basically where the citizens of Paris had their own little commune. They threw out the government. It was a revolt. It was brutally put down. And even before that, things like the French Revolution, where the members of the second and third estate, or the aristocracy and the clergy, were killed or were forced into exile, and their possessions were taken from them. So even Karl Marx, I'm not sure, was a real originator of communism. I think it's more of a degree. But he did coin that term, communism. So in his Communist Manifesto, that's where Karl Marx talks about history is the story of class struggle, and that there should be this kind of classless society. Again, think about the dominance model where you just flip the triangle up, squash the business and government, and then have this kind of egalitarian society. That's communism. That's not... Communism is a form of socialism, but it's not exactly the same thing. Also, again, Karl Marx advocated an egalitarian society, abolishing private property, those kinds of things. Again, those are specific to communism. Many socialist countries exist where people have private property. Again, all socialism is the idea that governments have some sort of a responsibility to their people. So, socialism in the United States sprung up in response to, again, as I mentioned, widespread child labor. Injuries in factories were harming workers. Abominable labor conditions. People were literally working themselves to death. And while people were working themselves to death, the wealth was concentrated in that mass of business and government at the very top. And people thought it was obscene, the discrepancy between wealth. So socialism also had some degree of successes in the United States. However, as socialism began to fizzle out, I would argue that many of their doctrines or their narratives kind of integrated themselves into our Republican and Democratic parties in a variety of ways. So I'd say that socialism is still alive, just we don't have a socialist party like you do in some of our in some European countries. Okay, so we have talked all the way up to the Great Depression. So our next discussion is going to be about the Great Depression and World War II, and then all the way through contemporary society.